everybody. Today's practice problem comes from Principles of Microeconomics by Dirk Mateer and Lee Kopic. We're going to be doing Chapter 6, Problem number 8. The problem begins as follows. It says, the cost of many electronic devices has fallen appreciably since they were first introduced. Anybody who goes to Best Buy and sees that their TV now costs like $3 and they paid like $1,300 for it knows exactly what this is talking about. So for instance, computers, cell phones, microwaves, and calculators not only provide more functions but do so at a lower cost, or in more precise economic terms, at a lower price for the consumer. Illustrate the impact of lower production costs, or equivalently in this case, increased technology, right, on the supply curve. And then it says what happens to the size of the consumer and producer surplus. So let's start by thinking about our supply and demand diagram, and then we'll go from there. So let's just start with our basic diagram. Again, we're thinking about market supply and demand, so we have a capital Q on the horizontal axis and price, or P, on the vertical axis. And we don't know anything specific about our supply and demand curve, so let's just draw a normal supply and demand curve. Notice I started this guy kind of up high on the vertical axis. And I did that, I cheated a little bit because I knew, based on what we were told in the problem, that we were going to be increasing supply. So I needed some room to actually move to the right or equivalently downwards. And then we can put a demand curve, something like this, just a basic demand curve. Don't know a whole lot about it. And then we can think about what this change means for our supply and demand diagram. And like we said earlier, that we could either think about this change as a decrease in input prices. You know, maybe literally the components for these different electronics got cheaper, making the finished electronics themselves cheaper as well. Or maybe it's the case that there was an increase in technology where, given a certain amount of inputs or resources into the production process, we could get more out of that process than we did before. So there's a number of ways of thinking about this. But luckily, either way we think about it, the change being described is going to result in an increase in supply. And we said that an increase in supply was a shift to the right along the quantity axis. So we would get something in this particular scenario that looks like this here. Just call this S prime. And then if we're going to be analyzing consumer and producer surplus, the helpful thing to start by doing is labeling the old and the new equilibrium, both in terms of putting the dots at the intersections of the supply and demand curves, but also explicitly bringing them out to the axis and calling them, P star, Q star, etc. So let's do that here. We notice the original equilibrium is just here, so we can say that this quantity, call this Q1 star. And then we have a price here, call this P1 star. And then our new equilibrium is just here. So we can call this Q2 star here. And P2 star here. So we'll notice that the change that we're seeing is that the market is transacting more at a lower price than it was before. So we can come back and think about the impact that that has on consumer and producer surplus. When analyzing consumer and producer surplus, it's helpful to draw what's known as a welfare table. And the welfare table just gives us a way to show, at least qualitatively, consumer surplus, producer surplus, and if we want total surplus or social surplus before the change and after the change, so that then we can then explicitly analyze the changes in those amounts. So we can do that by just drawing a table. And we generally put the surpluses as the rows in the table, and then before, after, and change as the columns in our table. And I'm drawing this here in real time rather than just, cutting and putting it up, so that you can actually see how this is created. So what we essentially want in this particular case is we just want a 4x4 table. Because we only have three things to calculate surplus for: consumers, producers, and total. Because we don't have any government in this example, we don't have any, rest of society in this example, and so on and so forth. So we're going to need 3 rows plus 1 for the heading. Similarly, we're going to do before, after, and change. So we need 3 columns plus 1 for the labels here, which gives us a 4x4 block. So let's just do something like this. We can just say consumer surplus, producer surplus, and then total surplus. I'll call it TS. You could also call it social surplus. Sometimes you see that, and that would be SS. Same concept. And I can just say here, before, after, and change. And the change is just going to be after minus before. So we have our table set up, and the next thing we need a helpful way to actually represent the areas so that we can put them in this table. We don't have any numbers, so what we could do instead is we could label the different areas of our graph with letters, and then just add up the letters. And figuring out the most helpful way to do this, if it's not done for you, it's a little bit of an art, so I definitely recommend practicing this. But basically what you want to do, and most of it we've already done here, is label the relevant prices and quantities, and then extend those lines up into the area that you're going to be calculating consumer and producer surplus for. So I can cheat a little bit here, and I notice that the before surplus is going to be this triangle here, and the after surplus is going to be this bigger triangle here. That's just based on the rules of consumer and producer surplus. So what I can do is I can notice that outside of this larger triangle, I don't have to label anything. So I don't have to label anything out here. And then I could just label each one of these areas inside that relevant surplus area. And it's actually not a problem if my areas are too small, if I have too many of them, because I can always add them up. I can always aggregate them up. That I would err on that side rather than on the side of having too few areas, because what you don't want to have happen is for you to label stuff and then you try to go through and calculate and you're like, oh, I wish I had divided that area, now this is complicated. So we could do something like the following. We could just say, this is area A, this trapezoid is area B, this triangle here is area C, maybe this funky looking area here, I'm not really sure what shape this would be, call this D. And then you have these 3 little areas here, these little triangles, and we just call them E, F, and G. And that should be sufficient. So the next thing we can do is we can use our rules for consumer and producer surplus to figure out what areas are relevant for the before and after scenarios. So let's start with before. We can say before, our relevant supply curve was here, and our relevant demand curve was here. So our consumer surplus, again with those 3 rules that we talk about, is just the area below the demand curve, above the relevant price to the consumer, to the left of the equilibrium quantity being transacted. That's just going to leave us with triangle A here. Let's put that here. For producer surplus, we said producer surplus is the area above the relevant supply curve. So if we're doing the before scenario, it's the supply curve here. So above the supply curve, below the price that the producer is getting, which in this case is the same as the price that the consumer is paying, and to the left of the equilibrium quantity. So here we can see that our producer surplus is equal to B plus C. Let's put this here. And then we can add these up and see that our total surplus is A plus B plus C. We can confirm that we did things right by looking at that area and seeing that it's this triangle here, which is what we were expecting. So far, so good. Now we can do the after situation. And the after situation, again, same rules. We say that consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve, above the relevant price to the consumer, which is now P2 star, the new equilibrium price, and to the left of the equilibrium quantity, which is now this Q2 star. So consumer surplus is now A plus B plus E plus F. So we can go over here. A plus B plus E plus F. Now we can think about producer surplus. Again, producer surplus is the area above the relevant supply curve. Well, now our relevant supply curve is this guy S prime. So above this line, below the relevant price to the producer, which is now P2 star, and to the left of the equilibrium quantity. So that's going to give us C plus D plus G. Let me put that over here. And if we were to add these together, we would see that the total surplus is now A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F plus G. So it's everything that we labeled, because that's how I decided what to label. So that's not entirely surprising. And we can see that that corresponds to this larger triangle, which is what we were expecting our total surplus to look like. So now we can go through and we can investigate these changes. And we can see, for example, that the change in total surplus in going from here to here, well, we added in D plus E plus F plus G. So we get an unambiguous increase in total surplus because of this increase in supply. We can also look at consumer surplus and say that there's an unambiguous increase in consumer surplus because in going from before to after, they added B plus E plus F. Analyzing this producer surplus is a little bit more complicated, because if we look at the change here, we see that going from before to after, producers added areas D and G, but they subtracted area B. So just looking at this, it's not entirely obvious whether this change is positive or negative. So to think about whether this change is positive or negative, we need to go back to our intuition about producer surplus, and we need to go back and think about what's going on at a higher level here. So I took away the letters in our diagram to clean things up a little bit, to make it a little bit easier to look at our producer surplus. So what's helpful to keep in mind here is that we said before that we generally model an increase in supply as a shift to the right of the supply curve, right? That we usually talk about our increase in supply like this here. But we could also think of our increase in supply as a shift downward of the supply curve, right? That there's some vertical distance between this S and this S prime. That vertical distance, or that vertical shift, isn't quantitatively necessarily the same as this horizontal shift, but there are really two ways of thinking about this. And if we were to think about the vertical shift, or the vertical distance between the old and new supply curve, because supply represents the marginal cost of production, this vertical distance between the two supply curves actually shows by how much marginal cost has decreased in this market as a result of, depending on how you think about it, the decrease in cost directly or the increased technology or increased production efficiency. So if we're thinking about this vertical shift or this decreasing cost, this gives us some insight into whether our change in producer surplus would be positive or negative. So here, again, we can think smartly about where to draw this vertical distance, and because we decided that this is going to be a parallel shift, the vertical distance between the curves is going to be the same everywhere. That doesn't have to be the case, but that just happened to be how we drew it here. That happens to be how we usually draw it. So I could represent the vertical distance between the two curves, or the decrease in cost, by this amount here, because that's just the vertical distance between the two curves. And to think about producer surplus, because producer surplus is just the difference between the price received and the willingness to sell, or the price received and marginal cost, since both willingness to sell and marginal cost are given by this supply curve. And what we see is that essentially what's happening is our cost of production is going down by this vertical distance here, but the price decrease is only this amount here. It's only the difference between these two dotted lines that represent our equilibrium prices. So we can see from this that the price decrease that the producer is dealing with is actually smaller than the cost decrease. And because producer surplus is that difference, or that wedge between the price received and marginal cost, this would imply that the producer surplus is actually increasing, that the producer is better off than he was before, or that they were before, because the price decrease was smaller than the cost decrease, so they're getting, in a way, a higher margin on everything that they're selling. And taken that way, if they're getting a higher margin on everything that they were selling, and they're able to sell more of it, that should mean that the producer is unambiguously better off. And from that, we can actually conclude that this amount here, this D plus G minus B, actually has to be, just based on our intuition, has to be positive. So we can summarize what's going on here. And we can think about the change in consumer surplus. It's not surprising that the change in consumer surplus is positive, because if we just look at our change in equilibrium here, we see that consumers are getting more, and they're getting more for a lower price. That's unambiguously better for consumers. We saw that this change in total surplus was unambiguously positive, because we know that the old surplus was this triangle here, and then the new total surplus was this larger triangle, so we had it augmented by this amount here. And lastly, we just showed that when we have an increase in supply, yes, we have a decrease in price, which doesn't sound like it's that good for the producer, but if the decrease in price is smaller than the decrease in cost, the producer ends up better off, as we're seeing here. So what we see is that this increase in supply is actually good for everyone involved. The last part of the problem asks, if consumer demand for cell phones is relatively elastic, who is likely to benefit the most from the lower production costs? So we can draw a supply and demand diagram with fairly elastic demand and figure out where this leaves us in terms of our market equilibrium, and then we can use that to think about our consumer and producer surplus. So let's draw this. Again, we want to start with just our basic supply and demand diagram, where we have market quantity on the horizontal axis and market price on the vertical axis. And it says here, if consumer demand is relatively elastic, and so we can think about what that means, and we decided that inelastic demand was more vertical and elastic demand was more horizontal. So we would have a situation where demand looks something, relatively flat like this here. And you can also always confirm to yourself that this makes sense, because we know that price elasticity of demand is percent change in quantity divided by percent change in price. So here, we would want, if we had elastic demand, we'd want that to be a big elasticity number. So we would want our percent change in quantity demanded to be large compared to our percent change in price. And that's what we see here, because for a small change in price, we had a relatively large change in quantity demanded. And then we could just add on to this, just a basic supply curve, because we weren't told anything about supply. We just make it look like that. And then we could think about what this means when we have an increase in supply. Now I broke my own rule here, and I started this kind of too low on the vertical axis. So when I increase supply, I get something down here that looks a little bit weird for our supply curve. But the point remains nonetheless. Maybe we have a supply curve that's shifted to something like this here. And what we can do to start analyzing the well-being of consumers and producers is to identify the old and the new equilibrium. So we could see here, our old equilibrium price, or P1 star, is here. Our old equilibrium quantity, or Q1 star, is here. Our new equilibrium price is here, and we call that P2 star. And our new equilibrium quantity is Q2 star, which is just here. So we can think about what's going on here. And the first thing that we notice is that when demand is very elastic, this increase in supply actually doesn't bring the price down that much for the consumer. So we can say, well, the consumer is still better off, because we said whenever there's a supply increase, both the consumer and the producer are better off. And we can see that the existing consumers in the market, they're better off, but only by a little bit, because their price only went down by a little. But then there are a decent amount of new customers in the market who are getting surplus when they couldn't before. So there are two avenues by which consumer surplus is increasing. But this price didn't drop a whole lot. So the main benefit is coming from the fact that these new consumers were coming into the market. But because demand is so elastic, any one of those consumers didn't get a whole lot of surplus. On the other hand, if we think about producers, we can see that producers' costs, because we said that their cost was represented by the vertical distance between the old and the new supply curve, or at least the cost decrease was represented by this wedge here, that the producers' costs went down by a lot compared to the decrease in price. So the producers are in a way getting a higher margin than they were before, and they're able to sell a lot more units. So if I were to compare and answer the specific question, who is likely to benefit the most from the lower production costs, it's probably going to be the producers, because the benefit to the producers, or the increase in the benefit to the producers, is pretty big, both because their cost decrease is very large compared to the price decrease, and also because they were able to sell a lot more units than they were before. Whereas we said the impact on consumers was likely to be smaller because their price increase, or their price decrease rather, is small, and the main benefit therefore is coming from getting these new guys into the market, but these new guys were fairly low surplus, so I would give the advantage to producers in this case.